And actually, the flip side of that is how to measure engagement on your websites. So as we go through the presentation today, we'll talk about defining bounce rate, talk through how analytics tools do and don't measure bounce rate, and then what they count as a bounce, and more importantly, what they do not count as a bounce. And then we'll move into some things we can do on the website to more accurately measure, as well as 6 other metrics besides bounce rate that might be more important for you and more useful to measure for your website. So we'll start by talking about what a bounce rate is. From all of my conversations that I have working with a lot of publishers across the world and across the whole spectrum of size, this is the one metric that is consistently misunderstood in a lot of different ways. So when we talk about defining bounce rate, I'll start with what a bounce rate or what a bounce is not. So when we are talking about bounce rate, it has nothing to do with conversion. That's a very, very common one that I hear, where people will talk about bounces as people who didn't actually convert on the site, didn't purchase anything, or didn't sign up. Has nothing to do with time. It's not people who stay on your site for less than a minute or anything like that. Has nothing to do with watching a video or actually doing anything on your site, or even the simple people leaving your site. Somebody leaves your site, it's not necessarily a bounce. The only thing that is tracked as a bounce in online analytics packages is the percentage of sessions with a single interaction. And I'll go into a little more detail of how that's tracked here now. So when when a user loads your website and you have something like Google Analytics or Omniture or Chartbeat or any analytics package installed, what happens is as that page loads, the web browser sends out a little tracking beacon to Google Analytics or whatever your analytics is that says, hey, I just saw a person on this page. When they go to another page on your website, a second beacon is sent out. And the analytics package knows, I've already seen that user before. This is their second page view. So in this first case, somebody comes to your website from Google, Facebook, wherever, clicks a link. So now they view 2 pages. Google Analytics is going to record 1 user, 1 session, and 2 page views. Whereas in the second example, if somebody comes in from Google, reads your page, and the analytics package doesn't see them again, there's no more tracking beacon sent for that user, that counts as a bounce. What's going to be recorded is 1 user, 1 session, and 1 page view. The information that's sent out, and this is just one example of a tool called Analytics Debugger. Adobe also makes a great one if you're using Omniture, where you can see what information is being sent from a user's browser. If you're using Tag Manager or any of the Google Analytics packages, there's a Tag Manager extension that is just awesome, Tag Inspector. And then this is one called Analytics Debugger that I've used for years. But this is an example of what gets sent out every time a user loads your page. There's a client ID, which identifies me as a user here, has a bunch of information about my browser, how big the window is, as well as information about what pages I'm viewing, what the traffic source. It's all embedded in this little tracking beacon. And that's all analytics can see of your page, and what users are doing is what is being sent out in these beacons. So we'll come back to the analytics a little bit later. But let's start with some additional things that your default setup will not count as a bounce. So if a user comes to your site, reads the page, clicks on any other links on your site that take them to a different URL, that's not going to count as a bounce. If a user goes to your site and begins a purchase funnel, say it starts your sign-up process or starts your purchase process, if that's on another URL, it's not going to be counted as a bounce regardless of whether or not they purchase. Again, because Google or your analytics package has seen a second interaction. If a user visits your site and performs any other action that you've marked up with analytics code, watching a video, clicking a Facebook button, anything like that, they're not tracked by default, but if you set them up to be tracked by Google Analytics, they'll see that as a second interaction, and it will not count as a bounce. And then one last call out, because it's kind of an edge case, but it's an interesting one. If a user comes to your site, closes the tab or closes their browser, and then comes back within 30 minutes, most analytics packages are still going to consider that the same visit to your website, because it's within half an hour, And if they're reading multiple pages, it will not count as a bounce. And there are some, kind of edge cases of the edge case. If the user happens to clear their cookies, if you're around midnight, when it flips the day, all the sessions reset, that type of thing. But in general, think of it as a 30-minute session. Now let's look at what analytics setups do count as a bounce. And again, this is the default installations. If a user comes to your site, reads one page, hits the back button, that's your classic bounce. But if they read your page and actually close the browser tab, regardless of how they leave your site, analytics isn't going to see them again, so it'll count as a bounce. But there's also things that are on the page, if we're not tracking them with Google Analytics, that they do, that that will look like a bounce, even though they've done something. For instance, most Facebook buttons, tweet buttons aren't marked up with analytics code. So if somebody were to share your article, then leave the website, still going to count as a bounce. Same thing for filling out forms or anything else that you may want a user to do. If it's not tracked with analytics, it'll probably still count as a bounce. Same thing with online video. If you don't have the actual video player marked up, it's going to count as a bounce. And my important call out there is that a bounce is not necessarily a bad thing. If you're a content site and somebody comes, searches on Google for a topic, comes to your page, reads your article, watches a video, and leaves, that's a pretty successful visit. So it's important to keep in mind that a bounce is not always a bad thing. Now, I talked earlier about those traffic beacons that your analytics packages send out when a user loads a page. And there are a lot of things we can do to actually manipulate that and change the default installation to more accurately track a bounce rate. So one thing that I use often is for a content website, if somebody stays on a page for 30 seconds, that means they've read a significant part of the article. And that may be something that I don't want to track as a bounce. So what I can do is I can actually set out an event in either Google Analytics or Omniture or any of your other packages that says if somebody reads this article or spends over 30 seconds on this page, fire an event. And that means that Google will see a second interaction and it won't count as a bounce. I always like marking up social media buttons. If you're a content website, you want to get your content out there, so tracking the social media buttons will also reduce your bounce rate and a little more accurately show what people are doing. Video plays. If video is important to you, if you make your money off video ads or any other kind of consumption, add analytics code to the video player so you can track what people are doing. Infinite scroll and lots of different designs of being able to scroll right on a mobile device and things like that are coming out. So it's also really important that if you do use infinite scroll, that you're firing the analytics beacon again so that you can track those second and third, fourth page views. Very common when I see when people move to infinite scroll, their page views go way down because they don't have those second and third page views tracked. It's an easy one to forget. As we move forward a little bit, I'll call out that your bounce rate will vary quite a bit. And this is another reason why I think it's a very misunderstood metric, is that people come into your site from different traffic sources, different regions, different languages are going to behave very differently on your website. So anytime we do look at these engagement metrics, I encourage you to segment it in a way that makes sense for your website. So I grabbed these numbers from a news website, and we can see that their bounce rate of people who come into the homepage is only 30%. So 30% of the people scan the homepage, get what they need, and hit the back button. But if somebody comes in directly to an article on their website, meaning that they're likely coming from Google, they're likely coming from Facebook, something like that, 87% of the people read that one page and then leave. So if I looked at this, it would probably be a blended average of around 40% or something like that. But just looking at the high-level number doesn't tell me the whole story. Again, with the second one, traffic sources. Somebody's coming from Facebook, they likely just saw a link that either you shared or one of their friends shared. Whereas on Google, it makes sense that people are going to stick around your website a little more because they probably got your website after actively searching for something. If you're in e-commerce or you're trying to get people to sign up, you may be targeting a specific demographic, be it age, anything like that. And we can see for this particular website, does much better or women have engaged with the website much more than men, which is an interesting learning. Is it the content type that they had? Is it something to do with the design? It's worth looking at. So again, with any of these engagement metrics, make sure you dive into it and really understand what's behind that the bounce rate or the engagement metric, so that you can make your decisions based off of these different segments. And the last thing that I want to talk about before I summarize my thoughts on bounce rate and move on to engagement metrics is that your bounce rate can affect your traffic. And I get a lot of questions about this because Facebook and Google make their announcements that aren't always clear. But in this case, both companies have given us quite a bit of guidance on this. Facebook has explicitly said that the time on your site when somebody clicks a link from Facebook affects how well you show up in the newsfeed. Google has never actually come out and said that they use this, but it makes total sense to me, and everybody's pretty sure that they do. If somebody were to actually search for something, come to your website, go back to Google, and click on the next link, that's a pretty good sign to Google that your page is not actually fulfilling what the user wanted for that query. We call it pogo sticking if you're in SEO, but it's a great way to think about your website and how it's presented, and think about a bounce, because if you're not fulfilling that user's need, if you're not getting them to engage with your page at all, spend any time, it's worth looking at either doing a redesign, maybe tweaking your content a little bit. But to summarize, cutting down on your bounce rate, getting people to actually engage with your website will help both Google and Facebook traffic. I've seen it time and time again. So to summarize the bounce rate before we move on is that it's not necessarily a bad thing. You may have delivered exactly what that user is looking for with a single page view. So it's worth considering whether or not it's important for you to have multiple page views, or if you can actually meet that user's need, capture the email address, get the ad click with one page view. And the second call out is that bounce rates are very easily manipulated. It's very common when I'll log into a new analytics account and see the bounce rate jump all over the place. And a lot of that is due to the things that I mentioned earlier. If somebody were to mark up their Facebook buttons or switch out their commenting system to something that's tracked by analytics, your bounce rate is going to change pretty dramatically. So be conscious of those things as you're looking at the bounce rate. And then my third approach here is to track engagement metrics. Instead of tracking the negative of trying to figure out how many people left, let's look at some very specific metrics you can track to show where people are engaging and how people are engaging with your site, that can actually lead to your desired actions. So I'll go through all 6 of these in a little bit more detail here, but the 6 that we're going to look at: time on site, pages per session, sessions per user, conversion metrics, media consumption, and then other events very quickly. So session duration is an interesting one. It's a different approach to looking at pages per visit or looking at your bounce rate, in that you're actually measuring the amount of time people are working with your website or looking at it. And on the right here, we can show how the analytics packages are actually going to track that, much like we showed with the page views earlier. So if a user loads you page 1, reads it for 10 seconds, clicks to the next article, spends about 15 seconds there, and then clicks to page 3, and they can spend as long as they want there. What's interesting about this is your analytics package will only track a 15-second session. Even though they spend another 35 seconds on that page 3, analytics has no idea that happened because you're not visiting a page 4, and there's no beacon being sent out, which is why I mentioned earlier that I often like to send one out after 30 seconds or something like that to give you a better idea. But the key is your analytics packages will only track the time from when they first see a user to the last tracking beacon being sent out. And again, as I mentioned, take a look at this for all of your different traffic sources, your different content types. It's going to vary quite a bit by any segment you throw at it. Engagement metric number 2, pages per session. So this is an interesting one. We can see in this particular example that there was a pretty big dip between March and April, and that was a redesign. And that, what I want to call out on this particular metric is that more than a lot of them, this is driven by page design. If you have related links at the bottom of your articles, if you have a Taboola recirculation widget, that's going to help encourage users to click to the next article after they've read yours. Again, in this case, it's a content provider. But any small changes you make to that article's page or the page's design is going to impact this quite a bit. So pages per session is a great one. Seeing this dip over time tells me that we're either changing our content type that's not meeting users' needs, or that we need to tweak our design a little bit here. Sessions per user is an important one. If you depend on users coming back to engage with your content 2, 3, 4, 5 times before they take your desired action of purchasing something or signing up or anything like that, or if you're a news website that depends on ad revenue, you want people coming back to your website, and the sessions per user reports in Google Analytics and Omniture are a great way to look at that. This particular publisher gets a lot of traffic from Facebook, which is why we see such a huge number of sessions that is just one, or a huge number of users that only created one session during this month. Fair amount of people that came back 2 and 3 times, and it dips off from there. You'll often see this as kind of a bell curve, where you have a lot of really loyal people spending a lot of time on your website and coming back 2, 3, 4 times a day sometimes, and an awful lot of people that only come once. And our goal is to get people to move down this chart, right? If we can get a few more people to come back, that's pretty important. So as you're making redesign or content changes or anything else, as you're making those decisions, this is a great one to look at. And conversion is an interesting one to talk about because conversion is going to be very different for every website, but I wanted to call it out. In the case in the upper left-hand corner here, their goal is to get people to download your app, and so they created a goal of sending somebody to the App Store. They're tracking when somebody clicks off their website, goes to the App Store, that's their goal. And once I've set that goal, it can be based on a URL, it can be based on an event, it can be based on signing up for a form or anything. Once I've set what I want users to do, any analytics package is going to give you a lot more data. In the upper right-hand corner, we can see they've assigned a value for their conversions. So it's a total dollar amount, and it'll tell you things like your goal conversion rate. There's a lot of reporting around what traffic sources are converting. But my key here, you can choose just about anything you want to be a goal. And you can have multiple goals for your website. So tracking people to the explicit thing that you want them to do will give you often a lot more information and a lot more actionable data than just tracking something like a bounce rate or a very general metric. If you're creating content, if you're creating videos, if you're spending the money to actually produce the videos, you want people to watch them. So mark that up on your page. Don't just put a YouTube widget in there where you can't tell exactly how many people have viewed it. Whether it's YouTube or whether it's a native video player, you can add all sorts of information. In these cases, there's a whole bunch of different ways you can do this, but upper left, we actually track when the video starts, we track when an ad is seen, how many people actually got to the end of the ad, because their video advertising is very important to them. On the right-hand side, the video advertising is a little less important, so we actually focused on how people are interacting with the video widget. When they click play, when they click pause, or how many people got to the end of the video. With galleries, you can do the same thing. In the bottom left corner, we actually track how deep they get into a gallery, regardless of what gallery it is. And this will help us make decisions around design and functionality in the gallery and see if we were successful with any changes. So in this case, you can see that quite a few people get to page 2, but it drops off pretty quickly after that. And for metric 6 is any other custom event that matters to you for your website. In this case, these are all a little bit less about more accurately measuring bounce rate, and more about actually tracking this, what you want users to do. On the left-hand side, you can see that we've marked up their social buttons because social traffic is very important to this website. And we can see how many people are commenting, how many people actually click the Facebook share or like button, email, Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. Mark those up. It's great data. In the upper right-hand corner, we want to track how people are moving around the website. And so we actually trigger events if they go from one section, happens to be a Canadian website that I took a screenshot of, but if they're going and navigating across different regions, we wanted to know that. So we just marked it up with an event. Things like read more buttons. Anything you're doing that users are interacting with can be marked up. And quite often, those are great things to measure because you're actively saying these things matter to me, and that's what I want to track, as opposed to just looking at something like a bounce rate, where all you know is that the user viewed one page and left. And this is a discussion that I love having. And as you're trying to choose what types of things you're going to track and choose what's important to you, it's important to think about what your goal for the website is. If your goal is ad revenue, then I tend to look at that as a function of frequency, depth, audience, and RPM. So it's how often do people come back, how deep do they go into the website when they're there, how many people do I have in this mix, and how much am I making for every page view. So you can break that down into very specific metrics, some of which we've talked about today. Visits per user, pages per visit, number of users, and that gives you your total amount when you include the dollars. So for your website, it may be you may be looking at signups. So you want to look at this, and when you break it down to this level of detail, we can talk about different things you can do to increase visits per user, increase pages per visit. These are specific things that you can use to draw people back in and set goals for your website to increase all of these metrics and therefore your revenue. So just take a step back and think about what you're trying to get users to do, and that's what we want to track and optimize for. So Lindsay, do we have any questions coming in?
Okay, great. So if anyone has questions, you can just write them in here to the questions widget on your right-hand side of your GoToWebinar panel. It looks like our first question here is, if one of your goals is to increase email signups, what is the best metric to track that?
So email signups are an interesting one, depending on what kind of website you're on and what your design is. The biggest thing that I've seen that we can do to affect email signups is change the placement of your signup. So a lot of people will put a newsletter signup in kind of the upper right-hand corner mixed in with the ads, but that's not where the user's attention is focused. They're going to be focused on your article or on the core part of your page. So if email signup is something that's important to you, put that conversion at the bottom of your article because that's where the attention is going to be focused. And moving that around and testing different ways of actually getting people to enter information into that box is going to be pretty important. Obviously, as we talked about earlier, make sure that you're tracking that event with your analytics package, and that way you can actually see what traffic sources are working and that type of thing. Another call is to make sure that you're conscious of what process people have to go through for email signup. Sometimes you'll implement it where you just have to enter your email box and click OK, but sometimes you'll have a multi-page form, and make sure you're tracking each step for that user so that you can see where they're dropping off and where you might need to make some changes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another one coming in here is they say that bounce rates, they normally thought of being a negative effect on their website. Can you elaborate a little bit more about how bounce rates can be seen in a positive light?
I think it comes back to choosing your KPIs or your key performance indicators, by the way, but choosing what it is that you want people to do on your website. If you're an e-commerce site, your end goal is to get people to purchase. Um, so a bounce, if somebody comes, spends a couple seconds and leaves, doesn't do anything for you. But if I'm a news website, my goal may be to get my core audience, my local audience, to come back to my website every day. So in that case, somebody coming once, twice a day, only reading one article and leaving, maybe they're coming from Facebook or they're finding me on Google, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I would look at the bounce rate as just another piece of data that you can use to make your decisions. But it all comes back to deciding what it is that you want users to do and making sure you're tracking that. So for some sites, single bounce is pretty bad. For some sites, not so bad at all.
Okay, great. Let's see. If our attendees have any other questions, please feel free to send them on in. We have some extra time here.
Everybody's quiet this morning.
Yeah, it's very quiet. I mean, they have no excuse. It's afternoon there. Okay, I do have one more here. It's saying if they only learned how to, tap into using one metric, what do you think is like the most important metric to track performance?
If I was going to choose one, see, that's tough. It comes back to this equation that I was working with earlier. Focusing on any one metric is tough unless you have a very, very, very focused website, because typically, looking at one metric, you're going to make decisions in a vacuum. So if I'm looking at this particular equation here at the bottom, and if I looked at pages per visit dropped a little bit, I might start making drastic changes to my website, change the content, add galleries, start doing different things to focus on that particular metric. But if the pages per visit are going down a little bit, but my number of users are doubled, then I'm probably in a better place. I probably have a lot more overall engagement with the website. So that's a tough one to answer because any single metric is probably going to lead you in a different direction. You really want to understand what your goals are and what types of metrics add up to that major goal. But I guess if I had to pick one, I would say the number of sessions in a month is the one I tend to focus on, because if you've got more people coming in through your front door, if you have more people coming to your website, it's a lot more chances to convert, and all of these other metrics tend to fall in line.
Okay, great. Well, that looks like all the questions we have for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and thank you, Chris, for presenting. And just as a reminder, we'll have both a recording and a slide deck to share with everyone. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.